So hello everybody and welcome to this EU-side event, Drought Global Challenge. It's really a pleasure to be here with you all and with my colleagues and key experts on drought. Today we are going to discuss with them several aspects connected to drought, the challenges but also opportunities, and I hope you will enjoy staying with us. So we can now start with the presentation. Next slide, please. It's really, as I said, a great pleasure. For the ones that don't know me, I'm Andrea Toretti from the European Commission Joint Research Center, and I lead the Copernicus European and Global Drought Observatory of the Emergency Management Service. Without wasting other time, I would like to enter into the core part of this session by inviting my colleague Gustavo. And I would like to start discussing with Gustavo about drought and impacts, and to discuss and try to understand with Gustavo what are the sectors that are most affected by drought.
Yeah. Thanks, Andrea, for the introduction. So I'm Gustavo Naumann. I'm a senior researcher at CIMA Foundation. We are in Savona, Italy. Yes, I would like to discuss today with you on the sectors and how to then can improve and enhance our sectorial risk assessment. So what do we know? Is that drought affects almost all dimensions of the environment and also the society. And this impact influences in many ways the achievements of the SDGs. Drought conditions frequently remain unnoticed until water shortage becomes severe and adverse impacts on the environment and society become evident. Drought impacts, yes, thanks. Drought impacts may be influenced by adaptive buffers. For instance, let's think about the water shortage of purchase or the possibility of purchase of livestock feed, or can continue long after precipitation returns to normal conditions. The slow development and long duration of drought may combine with impact beyond commonly noticed agricultural losses and complicated quantification and also the attribution of those drought impacts. Indeed, drought impacts can be classified as direct or indirect. Direct impacts occur through interaction among specific water deficit and environmental, social, or even economic components. Indirect or secondary impacts are those that are not direct result of the water deficit and are often produced at a distance, meaning a distance in space, but also in time from the drought region, or also they could be a result of a complex impact pathway. Examples of direct impacts include, no, please keep the, yeah, thanks. Examples of direct impacts include limited public water supplies, crop loss, reduces forest production, limited commercial shipping capacities, but also ecosystem, for instance, drying up of wetlands, damage to buildings, that this might be linked with terrain subsidence in specific conditions, and also reduce energy production. However, drought impacts are often indirect because of their dependence of livelihoods and economic sectors on water. Those indirect effects can cascade quickly through the economic system, affecting regions far away from where the drought originated and persist long after the drought finalized. Those indirect impacts relate to secondary consequences on natural and economic resources that might also be directly affected. They affect also the ecosystem, but can affect biodiversity, human health, food prices, and poverty. In extreme cases, drought may result in temporary and permanent unemployment, business interruption, loss of income, but also could lead to rising school dropout rates and transmission of disease due to poor water quality, but also air quality linked with droughts. Droughts, the same way, can lead to food insecurity, malnutrition, and extreme cases, starvation, resulting in internal and cross-border migration. But now also thinking on the economic cost of droughts, these events could be one of the, compared with other natural hazards, could be one of the most damaging and costly climate-related disasters in many parts of the world. For instance, speaking on the European Union, so we have estimated recently annual losses per year to be around 9 billion at continental level. But also then, if we think and we look to the future, to the future scenarios, I'm thinking on really a bad end scenario to where the global warming could reach 4 degrees in an economy at the end of the century. Direct annual losses of drought in EU could reach the 65 billion euro per year in the absence of climate action. But for sure, if we work on the climate action, on mitigation, adaptation, those losses can be halved. So in that direction, identifying pathways towards more drought-resilient societies need to be really high up on the global political agendas. Cross-sectorial assessment of who and what is at risk, to what, where, when, and why will be key for proactive risk management and adaptation. For this, drought risk framework that capture these complex dynamics, but also taking into account cascading effect and non-linear interaction between all the risks mentioned, like the hazard, but direct and indirect exposures and system vulnerabilities across scales need to be taken into account looking into systemic perspective. So maybe next slide, please. So in that direction, so here I will briefly show an initiative from the European Commission that is supported by a consortia formed by CIMA, IBM, Amsterdam, UN University, Freiburg University, and Czech that goes in that direction. EDORA looks at the study of drought risk in a multi-sectorial way. The sector that we are looking at the EU 27 countries are agriculture, both rain-fed and irrigated, energy production, water supply, water transportation, and ecosystems. For this, we're building a database of impacts, theoretical frameworks for each sector, where we are looking on the drivers and cause of the root causes for them, and also looking on the cascading effects that we're identifying for each sector are the links between them. All this information will be used to create present and future risk map, including all the dimensions. All this information will feed a continental drought risk atlas, where we include the 3 dimensions on the hazard, exposure, and vulnerability for the present and future. So to conclude my intervention, so maybe my take-home measure for this speech is that we need to move beyond hazard-oriented and single sectorial perspectives and develop proactive, risk-informed, multi-scale, but also multi-sectorial and adaptive drought risk management policies, plans, and strategies that consider the full spectrum of all the possible impacts. So thanks a lot. So Andrea, back to you.
Thank you, Gustavo. Before continuing, I would like to remind our participants that you can ask questions via Slido. There is a red button that you can click on to access Slido below the live video. And now to continue, Gustavo, you mentioned ecosystems. So I would like to explore with Anna what could be the impacts of drought events, especially recurrent drought events on ecosystem functioning.
Yeah, thank you, Andrea. So we know that in many regions of the world, we expect drought to become more frequent or more intense. Oh, I should have introduced myself, I guess. So I'm a scientist at the Max Planck Institute for Biogeochemistry, and I work on carbon cycle and ecosystem interactions. Precisely. And so can we move to the next slide? Yeah, so we know that drought is expected to become more frequent, more intense, or even both in many regions of the world under climate change. And one of the things I would like to talk about here is how this increased frequency of droughts might impact ecosystem stability in the future. And in this first figure, I'm showing a scenario without climate change, where we can think about ecosystem activity, health, function, biomass, any other kind of metric that we might want to use to measure stability of ecosystem functions and services. to vary around some reference state. And when droughts or other extreme events happen, we would expect these to have a concurrent impact. We know this happens. We've seen happening all over the world when there's a drought. There's also forests are a little bit less productive. There might be some mortality. There might also be fires happening at the same time. But in addition to these concurrent impacts, there's also impacts that last over several years. And this can be because drought might create, might damage the systems of the trees. There might be also some other disturbances that take advantage of the fact that trees are stressed because of drought, for example, insects. And then trees and forests take some time to recover to the past condition. And so during this recovery time, of course, the recovery dynamics is also affected by the climate conditions in the recovery period. It's a bit like if we're ill and then we're still recovering and we have to go run a marathon. It's probably very hard. And so in the next slide, we can think about what would happen if then the hazards recur more frequently in time and so frequently that then they happen still, or a second hazard, a second drought, a second heat wave, a storm happens during the recovery period. And what might happen is that the impacts are first maybe amplified because the trees were already still under, to some extent, stress or had still to repair some damages from the past event. And there might be these cascading impacts of the second extreme event triggering what we call cascading disturbances, where, for example, there might be an increased risk of fire because maybe there's a lot of leaves on the ground because the trees shed their leaves in the past year under a past drought, or insects might grow easier because trees cannot defend themselves against them because they're kind of fighting other fights. And so it's really important to understand these legacy effects and how they might lead to compounding impacts over time. So compounding meaning that they might accumulate over time. And I would just like to show an example of one type of compounding effect of recurrent droughts that is happening still in many parts of Central Europe. If we can move to the next slide. We had an example of two extreme dry and hot summers in Europe in 2018 and 2019. And what we see in many regions of Central Europe is that there is some regions that are shown in the dark brown called a decline group of pixels or a group of regions that shows between 2019 to 2019 a decline of the forest conditions, so meaning that forests were less healthy or less vital as in 2019 as in 2019, even though the drought in 2019 was not as intense as in 2018. So one would actually expect forests to some extent recover a little bit. And this is what we see in all the other pixels in the other colors, that there's some recovery, even if it's partial. But so what's happening in this dark brown cluster is really interesting because it coincides to regions where we know there's been very large insect outbreaks. So bark beetles are killing the trees. We can see a photograph on the right. And we also see in the bottom that the tree mortality rates in Germany went from maybe about 0.1% a year to about 2% a year. So they're more than 10 times higher after these two hot and dry years. And so to finalize, one of the messages that I would like to talk about here is that we compared observations that are shown on the right top panel with models, land surface model simulations. And one of the things that we see is that the models were quite good at simulating the impacts of the drought in 2018, so the first drought, but then they were not really able to capture this decline in forest condition between 2018 and 19. So they were not really able to simulate this compounding effect of recurrent extremes. And so when we know that droughts are to become more frequent in the future, we also know that we need to be able to simulate these compounding impacts. And by not doing this, we might be overestimating the potential of forests to actually mitigate climate change in the future by absorbing CO2. Thanks.
Thank you, Anna. So we have seen impacts on socioeconomic sectors with Gustavo. We have discussed about ecosystem functioning with Anna and the impacts. What about population, mobility and migration? What can be done to reduce the risk of drought with respect to population? I would like to ask this question to Viola.
Thank you very much. My name is Viola Otieno, and I'm an Earth observation expert for early warning systems at EGAT, which is based in Nairobi, Kenya. And currently, the EGAT region is undergoing one of the worst droughts in history. And also, if you look at 40 years of data, you can see that this is one of the worst droughts as well. So we'll be talking about drought and population, and then answering the question whether mobility and migration can be triggered by drought, but also addressing what can be done to reduce those risks. Next slide. Thank you. So the answer to the first question is a definite yes, and this can be confirmed by reports as far as 1990. So the first IPCC report in 1990 clearly outlined that migration will be one of the consequences of climate change. And what we're seeing now is relatively climate change-induced drought happening in Eastern Africa region. And what we're seeing is that the mobility and migration has increased as well. As we speak, about 1 million people in Somalia alone have been forced to move in search of water and food security. And when you look at drought as a driver of migration, you're looking at internal migration, so within the country, but you're also looking at cross-border migration as well, which is happening a lot between the Ethiopia, Somalia, Kenya borders. Most of the time, this is driven by water and food security, which has been mentioned before as well. And if you look at the figures, 700 million people in Africa will be displaced by drought in 2030. I would like to actually correct that. So the correct figure is between 31 to 143 million people will be forced to move, not just by drought, but also by other climate-induced extremes. 700 million people are the number of people who will move who will slide into poverty by 2030. Most of the time, what we're seeing is rural to peri-urban or rural to urban migration. And majority of the people who are moving are mostly men who are moving in search of labor in the urban centers. And what we see is that money is being sent back to the rural areas. But when there is nothing to use use the money to buy, then still the problem persists. You cannot look at human mobility without looking at the impacts, or you cannot be able to understand the severity of human mobility without looking at impacts. So when you have people moving from one location to another, you are definitely going to see resource-based conflicts because they are moving from one area and moving to an area which already has a population existing there, and people are fighting for resources. And what we see is for drought, for example, most of the time the drought covers a very extensive area as opposed to floods, for example. And what that means is that the humanly possible distance that these people who are moving can cover leads them to a similarly affected area. So you see a lot of resource-based competition and resource-based conflicts as well. And this has been documented for Kenya and for Somalia and also Ethiopia as well. The other impact is rapid urbanization. As people are moving from the rural areas to the urban areas, the question is, can the urban areas be able to accommodate the increase in the rapid increase in the number of people moving there? The other one, which is very concerning, is the rapid increase in refugee population. And what happens as this refugee comes is that you see a decline in provision of water and food. So there's not enough water and food. And what you also see is an impact on health as well. So you have outbreaks of cholera, for example. You have high levels of malnutrition happening at this refugee camps. So what you're seeing is that as much as mobility and migration is an indirect impact of drought, the effects or the cascading impacts are quite severe on a population in the region as well. Next slide. So what can be done to reduce this risk? So the theme for COP27 is Together for Implementation, and that brings me to the first point, which is strengthened partnerships. So a single sector within the government or within the humanitarian or non-governmental organization cannot be able to tackle this. It's a multi-sectoral approach that will be able to provide viable solutions. We're looking at multi-agency as well, but also intergenerational as well. As people are moving, the youth are more likely to move faster compared to the older generation. So we need to have an intergenerational solution as well. When you look at the current drought in Eastern Africa, you're looking at a very protracted drought. So this is the longest drought we've had in the region. It started in October, November, December. That season failed in 2020. It has carried on through 2021 and now also through 2022 as well. So whatever means the population had to survive, they're not being given a chance to be able to recover from the drought, but also from the other compounding disasters that are happening in the region as well. I'll give an example as well. While we have the drought, we also had flash floods happening at the same time. So you have a long period of drought, then it rains for one day, maybe in the highlands, not specifically in the areas affected by drought, and then you have flash floods happening as well. So again, it requires us to look at it from a multi-sectoral approach as well. What else could be done is, so back to my point on climate resilient development, when you have such a protracted disaster or drought happening, you need to be able to look at long-term solutions. If you look at the projections, we are expecting increased frequency, increased severity, but also increased longevity when it comes to droughts. So to be able to deal with that, you need to look at climate resilient development as long-term solutions. We are also looking at increased adaptation, loss and damage funding. So I've attended a few of the sessions at COP27, and yesterday I attended one on climate finance for Africa. And as much as we're talking about increased adaptation funding, for most of the African countries, even access to the existing adaptation funding is an issue. So we need to look at how do we resolve this access problem so that people are able to then implement the adaptation solutions. The other one would be frameworks to support countries to implement climate mobility. Again, I had a very good statement, which was there is a gap between intent and implementation. So the intent to be able to carry out climate action is clearly there, but then there is a gap between that and implementation. And some of the time it's because people are not very clear on how to proceed. So creating frameworks that support countries to integrate climate mobility into climate change and migration policies, that could be a start. And in that context, the East African context, we have the Kampala Declaration on Migration and Environment and Climate Change, which was launched at COP27 as well. And this policy instrument provides a framework the countries within Eastern Africa to be able to connect migration and climate change, but also to be able to ensure that, or give them a basis to be able to ensure that when people are moving, you have a plan or solution for people to move, but you also have a plan for people on the move as well. So where should they move? Is it possible to have this very deliberate in terms of where can people move, but also the people who are on the move, how do you protect these people, but also people to stay, solutions for people to stay. So is it possible for us to avoid the move? Because the move comes with other challenges as well. Cultural erosion, for example. So one community moves from this area to the other area, and if they move permanently, then a bit of the culture is lost in that as well. So I think that at the end of the day, what needs to be done is that we need to come together to implement this adaptation or the solutions that we need to be able to build the resilience within the communities to ensure that we have drought lands that are resistant to drought so that people are not forced to move from their original homes. That brings me to the end of the presentation. Over to you, Andrea.
Thank you, Viola. A reminder for all participants, if you have questions, just use the red Q&A button below the live video, and my colleague Guido Fioravanti will be happy to moderate and post also the questions in the live part of the session. So let's continue on human-water interaction. I would like to discuss with Anne what is the role of humans in the onset and evolution of drought, but also what sustainable management can do in reducing the risk.
Yes, thanks very much. Indeed, my name is Anne Hanloon. I'm Associate Professor in Drought Risk at IVM, the Institute for Environmental Studies in Amsterdam. And I would really like to echo and build on what my previous colleagues here in this session have said, and continue on the topic of the interactions between droughts and society and humans, and also indeed take that forward to see how we can work with that and manage to reduce drought risk. Next slide, please. So I want to point to this special report on drought that is been developed by the UNDRR. So the GAR report on drought, which gives us the overview of all the interactions that influence drought risk. And it's really important to stress that drought risk is actually this really complex interaction, like we've seen with the previous speaker as well, a complex interaction of physical and social systems. And I have also this quote here that says that human activities are exacerbating drought and increasing the impact. So it's really crucial to include humans in the picture. So I want to make also this point here to this audience that we should not see drought as a natural disaster, as something that happens to us and we're sort of at the end of the line, and the droughts are sort of coming from a climate system that is impacting us, but it also the fact that we are intertwined with the water system also gives us the opportunity to act and to do something. So as you can see, for example, in the hazard part, society and economy are influencing the hazard, but also there's the effect of management that can reduce this influence of people on the drought hazard. So that is a way in which we can actually reduce drought risk as well. Similarly, on the side of vulnerabilities. So to reduce drought impacts, we should also focus on the right side of this system, where we can have a really strong influence on what a drought hazard might lead to in society. So yeah, there is a lot of these aspects I think is really important, to consider, and I want to highlight a few in the next slide, please. So, and the first one, you click next, I think that should show up, is this really getting a grip on how much human activities are actually influencing the drought hazard. And because droughts are very long, humans take actions during the drought that influence the further development of the drought, but also the recovery, like one of my colleagues was already mentioning. The recovery phase of drought is really important, and what we do during the drought influences that. And to see how those activities are also shaped by changes in climate, and how the human activities and climate activities or changes interact is something we need to quantify. Indeed, next points are understanding more of the vulnerabilities and finding the link between the hazard and impacts. So if we know better what the vulnerabilities are and how impacts are linked to the hazard, then we can also manage those better. Another point I want to make is on feedbacks. So I already mentioned, like, droughts are long. There's lots of scope for actions, for management, for restrictions, for example, or support, aid for communities. But all those things can feed back again into hazards or into vulnerabilities. And it's important to take those into account. But I guess the take-home message is really droughts are something that we do actually have quite a lot of influence on, both on the hazard side, but also very much on the vulnerability and coping and impact side. So I guess a positive take-home message in trying to understand this whole system and then managing all the different part of it so that we can in the end reduce drought risk for people affected. Thanks very much. Thank you,
Anne. Our next colleague, Jose Marengo, had a last-minute issue. Unfortunately, he's not here with us today. So I would like to continue. And actually, I would like to ask Katrin about the role of early warning systems, but also the role of standardization and cooperation when it comes to drought. Katrin, we cannot hear you.
Okay, I guess now it's better. Okay, great. So thank you very much, Andrea, again, for the invitation to speak at this very important side event in the European Pavillion at COP. And as you said, my contribution is going to address the role of international collaboration and also standardization for early warnings in the context of drought risk management. So next, please. We know that early warning systems save lives and that they are part of proactive drought risk management, which is key to increasing drought resilience. And this is really one of the core themes of the WMO at the moment. Also, many of you know that earlier this year, the UN Secretary General announced the Early Warnings for All initiative, which aims at achieving access to multi-hazard early warning systems for every person on Earth by 2027. And so within this early warning system initiative, the challenge with drought really is that it's distinct temporal, spatial, and also impact footprint, which excludes it from most multi-hazard early warning systems. We just heard from Anne, for example, that it really has, much more time actually to take actions, to take considerations about restrictions and so on in water use. So this challenge for the early warning systems really reflected by the number of WMO members that are reporting that they have a drought early warning system in place. And this is shown here on the lower right-hand side of the slide, that only 1/3 of the members who took part in the survey that the WMO conducted reported that they have a drought early warning system in place for the population at risk. And this is really also what reflects the challenges in the work ahead of us in achieving this call. So next slide, please. So how are we addressing this challenge? So you can see here on the slide, we're developing a global drought classification system. And just because the name can already be a little bit misleading, I have inserted also here on the right-hand side a snapshot of the EUMETNet meteor alarm, which is quite topical since we are here also in the European Pavillion. So this map viewer is summarizing the current alerts issued at the national level for several hazards. So you can see, for example, strong wind, strong precipitation, and so on. And these warnings are harmonized to 3 levels: moderate, severe, and extreme. And this system shows pretty well what we're trying to achieve with the global drought classification system as a contribution to the global multi-hazard alert system by the WMO. In really elevating the national authoritative warnings. And there's a real need for easily available authoritative warnings. And this system is meant to be a driver and also a vehicle for the following, following points that I've put here also on the slide. So really identifying gaps in capability, facilitating investments, very importantly, in capacity development, but also promoting outreach and improving visibility and recognition of the national alerting authorities. And then, as the question also was alluding to, harmonizing and standardizing specific warning parameters and promoting cross-border cooperation. So in summary, international collaboration and standardization here to create a global view of drought alerts is really aiming to achieve early warnings for all through visibility of capacity and gaps on the one hand that can then be addressed, but also to use this visibility to create political momentum at the global level as well on drought early warning and management. Next, please. And so I already, talked about this kind of different status of drought as well. So we really need to take into account that drought resilience goes beyond early warning systems, especially for drought. Integrated water resource and land management, for example, play a crucial role in kind of long-term resilience. So proactive drought policies address this fact and ensure that drought management is integrated into the national policy framework. And here on the slide, I'm introducing the Integrated Drought Management Program, which is also co-sponsored by the WMO and the Global Water Partnership, but we're really working with a network of partners, and many of them are on the call today as well, including also FAO and UNCCD. And this was really created to support stakeholders at all levels in policy and management of droughts. Now, in order to achieve transformative change, we need to speak with one voice internationally. So the IDMP has established these 3 pillars of integrated drought management, which underpin the development of national drought plans or policies. So these are monitoring and early warning, risk and impact assessment, and drought risk mitigation, preparedness and response. And one of the major achievements really of the program of the IDMP is that the international community is really addressing proactive drought management with one voice. So just kind of looking back at what I've just presented, really we're looking at ever increasing drought risk, and this was also presented by the previous speakers. And we really need to step up our efforts and work on solutions. And so we're all together, the WMO and also the many partners, we're really, we're committed to doing so through leveraging the bottom-up approaches as the warnings by the national authorities, increasing political momentum, and supporting joint initiatives such as the Integrated Drought Management Program. So we speak with one voice to increase drought resilience. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Katrin. And now I would like to discuss about the future of drought risk with Daniel.
Nice. Okay, thank you, Andrea. Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me? Yes. First of all, let me introduce myself. My name is Daniel Tsegai. I'm a program officer at the United Nations Convention to Combat Desertification. Let me start with what is the future of in terms of drought risks. Before I say that, let me probably say a few words about the Conference of Parties at Abidjan in May 2022, drought was one of the highly debated issues among 197 parties of the UNCCD. Countries were discussing what to do in order to reduce the impacts of drought sustainably, especially under the convention. There were two opposing views. One was, let's go for a more implementation on the ground. Drought does not give us time to negotiate about it, but there were also others who were looking for a more concerted legal instrument or financial instrument behind this drought. So it was really discussed. At the end of the day, they were able to at least create an intergovernmental working group on drought that is going to see how to sustainably manage drought. And so this is already recognized by countries that it is an issue that will not leave us soon, and it is going to live with us. So what is the feature? I think this map comes from a drought in numbers that was published at COP15, where it was highly well received, and you already know the numbers. It is very frightening. The Western United States, for example, for the past decades has seen the driest in 1,200 years. The mega drought in Chile was maybe for the 13th consecutive year. Europe has seen one of the severest droughts, probably going to be the worst in about 500 years. It is said to be. And Horn of Africa, I think Viola was also highly and also in a very eloquent way explaining the situation in this region, and also Australia. So one thing that we can learn from this map is drought does not discriminate. It affects the rich and the poor, the north and the south equally, and it has now become a global issue, and it needs also a concerted solution. Next slide, please. So now in the future, of course, as I have already alluded to, by 2041, in 4 children will be living under the extreme water shortage. And we are also expecting in about 130 countries will be experiencing increasing drought in exposure in the next few years. And climate change is expected to increase. Of course, we know it, the risk of drought. By 2050, 3 in 4 people will live in drought situations. And it will also have some impacts on migration. People will be displaced, about 700 million people in Africa by 2030. In Africa, we will have about 1.4 billion by 2030. That means 1 in 2, half of this population will be affected and displaced as a result of drought. So what to do about it? First, governance and policy mainstreaming is very important. Governments must redouble their efforts to embed drought resilience. And this they are doing. At the UNCCD, we have supported about 70 plus national countries to develop a national drought policy based on this principle of risk reduction. So at least they know what to do next, who is going to do what, the command chain when drought strikes. And I think it's very important in this session also to discuss gender mainstreaming. Why? Because drought knows gender. It is not effectively affecting the population equally. So it's always good to make sure that women and children are called by name, that they are most disproportionately affected by drought. And at the UNCCD, we also try to see the land tenure aspect of it, because land is a nexus between land and drought. If you rehabilitate your land, if you invest on your land, you can mitigate the impacts of drought. It can really harness the infiltration capacity of the land, and you can still grow crops during drought. We have seen this, for example, in North Ethiopia, where there was a sustainable land management intervention. There was drought, and that part of the country was able to produce crops for 3 consecutive years, while you can see in your eyes the other part was without the SLM intervention. So I think it's very important that we recognize the importance of land. Preparedness and early warning, I think this has also been discussed by Catherine Eller from WMO. We need to make sure that early warning is not early action. So we need to make sure that the end beneficiaries of the information are also they also know about what to do next, not only that predicting, forecasting, but communicating and also giving the information on what are the likely impacts of the next drought. And response and recovery, this has also been, I think, mentioned by the previous speakers, where drought is a natural hazard, but it doesn't have to be a natural disaster. And with good preparedness followed by good response, we can still mitigate the impacts of drought. Before I finish, next slide, please. I would like to bring to your attention about the alliance that was launched at COP27 on November 7, COP27 in November 7. It was hosted by governments of Spain and Senegal. This alliance is spearheaded by these two countries, and now more than 30 countries, about 35 non-state actors, including UN and IGOs, have joined this alliance. And the purpose of this alliance is a kind of a collaborative platform, as the COP27 slogan says, together for implementation. Countries have already identified this is going to be the future, so let's work together on it. And now more than 35 countries have, more than 30 countries have joined this alliance. So it will be a collaborative platform which aims to catalyze political momentum, and it will also catalyze action that supports countries, cities, and communities. And the main purpose of this alliance is also to generate political momentum, because we need to sensitize governments to act on drought before it strikes, before it really brings about more severe impact. So political momentum to make drought resilience a priority for countries will also catalyze consolidation of regional initiatives. Lots of regional initiatives here and there, but there are some which need upscaling, which need outscaling, which we can really allow North-South and South-South exchange of experience. It will also promote full engagement of stakeholders, including the private sector is also going to be part of this alliance. So it will definitely also facilitate knowledge sharing and networking with other alliances. So this is very exciting, and I would like to also bring it to the attention of the audience and the speakers today that this alliance is going to be an open platform for everyone. I thank you.
Thank you so much. So we have seen a bit the future of drought risk, and now let's discuss adaptation and resilience with Roger.
Great, thanks. Can you bring up the slide, please? Perfect. So yeah, my name's Roger Polwarty. I work for the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. Part of what I do is work with people like Daniel and others, and with the International Drought Management Program and with JRC, many of the people that you see here, including groups like IGAD, through the Famine Early Warning System Network and elsewhere. So as we look at what we've been hearing and we listen to all these pieces, there are many studies, as everyone knows, since the Special Report on Extremes, all the way to the Special Report on Drought and the recent issues, the Global Land Outlook and the IPCC reports. And so in everything we're hearing, what are these telling us about and resilience? There's a lot of lessons out there in terms of being proactive. There's a lot of lessons as well in terms of being prospective. In other words, how do we respond to things like new information? And the prospective aspects of how do we not let new risks arise? So that combination is really critical. So when we look at cases from around the world, next slide, please, just click. Next, thanks. As we look at these cases from around the world, whether they are watersheds, whether they are in communities, whether they are basically globally networked, as in when drought happens in one place, how it affects global food security. In others, we know this explicitly from the Ukrainian and Russian droughts of 2010, but we also know there are transboundary issues occurring everywhere, from the Paraná-Paraguay system in South America to, of course, the Nile and the Colorado River. So there are multiple scales of drought is something we want to get a sense around. So if we can click, please. What are we learning from all of these activities? Well, we're learning a few things here. The local and international drought policies are, in fact, what's needed. This is where we are in the thinking. There are underlying risk drivers and impacts, as we've been hearing from everyone else. So early warning is extremely critical, but increasingly early warning across timescales is extremely critical. And as Catherine pointed out, the issue of drought is not simply amenable to a multi-hazard approach. And so we have to figure out how to think about the spatial and temporal scales of drought. We heard a lot about the assessment of vulnerabilities and the difficulties of understanding the costs and the importance of that. A big part, and you heard this from Viola as well, is the awareness of what the options are and then how coordination takes place. So these are things we know and have been trying to put into place. And as we think through this, in the special report that Anne and others mentioned, there's in fact quite a clear distinction here between the issues of drought across timescales, drought as single events, the roles of risk and resilience, and the difficulties of dealing with the systemic aspects of drought and the day-to-day, everyday threats that people feel. That temporal scale, that spatial scale, that almost psychological scale is something that drought actually brings to the fore. And as you can see on the slide that's been put up, as a result, the damages and costs resulting from drought are usually underestimated globally. So when we hear the numbers, usually they're, insured losses, they're costs that can be measured in terms of crop agricultural damage, but not necessarily always food security losses. And in fact, in some areas, we estimate that the costs are 2 to 3 times the amount of the immediate impact. So what do we do about this? How do we think about adaptation and resilience, knowing those issues above? As one of my mentors from a long time ago, a person by the name of Gilbert White used to say, if we know so much, why aren't we doing better? And now we know a lot of these issues, and you heard the value of early warning systems. We know that investments in dryland farming can bring us benefits. So if we go to the next slide, this is from a study. I don't know why the image came out that way, but there. Thank you. Yeah, so this is from a study by UNCCD, jointly with others. And if we look at the side on the left, if you would click, there's land degradation and habitat. If we click on the green side, we know where some of these interventions should take place that either lead to land degradation and habitat loss, or where some of the interventions might take place in science, policy, and practice that might help us move towards a more land-based disaster risk reduction and green recovery. So proactive and prospective matters. And as you know, a very famous Chinese proverb is, if we are not careful, we'll end up where we're going. And it's very clear which side of these science comes to bear in terms of land cover and land change, water versus water conservation. There's a lot of issues surrounding the notion of being proactive. I always like to tell people when we say let's be proactive, I say, yeah, you first. And the reason is that it implies some upfront cost. And what we're able to show through many of the studies of UNCCD in financing, UNDRR, certainly from other partners around the world, including IGAD, that in fact, the upfront value is realized almost immediately, not in 2050, not in 2100. That's great, but it has to impact people's everyday lives as well. So if we were to click, the challenge for innovation is to shift from responding solely on an event-by-event basis to addressing the propagation and accumulation of risk over time. Anytime, and I think Anne was very, very clear about this, that a hazard becomes a disaster when it overwhelms human capabilities and societal capabilities to respond. Now, that doesn't mean it's only physical or it's only social. It is, in fact, of course, a combination of both. Whenever we focus strictly on the social, we're then surprised by the magnitude of thresholds and in the way that Anna describes cascading hazards and risk. So the complexity is in linking surprises and thresholds with the accumulation of risk over time. People are living in vulnerable situations already, independent of the event. And as we know, the event exposes that risk. So that combination in that integrated figure that was in the GAR report gives a really good sense of the two sides of this. And the question is, what do we do given that complexity? It's easy to throw our hands up and say it's too complex to act on. But yet, in fact, when we think about systems, humans do not manage systems. We manage our interactions with systems. And so the idea is, where are the nodes of interaction that helps us move beyond pilots into financing and aligning the finance and support for adaptive systems. So it demands innovation. But most importantly, next slide, is drought is human. Don't go too quick to the next. Yes, thank you. I don't want to give the next talk. And so the idea here is, more than anything, you could certainly see the fires in Europe. You see what's happening in East Africa right now, very dramatic. So strengthening risk, knowledge, and governance for adaptation and resilience is vertical and horizontal, from the global to the regional and local. But it's also the issue that Gustavo raised. Sectoral approaches aren't working for us, and yet sectoral approaches, cross-sectoral approaches are in fact not encouraged by how we finance collaboration. We talk about collaboration, we talk about coordination, but we don't actually finance and support the people who make that happen. And I just wanted to make sure that people who are looking at this realize that on the screen, with the exception of me, you have very innovative individuals who are working on that space. And they take professional risks to work in that space because they're not single disciplines, they're not single issue, And as a result, academia, private sector, and others don't actually recognize the importance of the outcomes of collaboration. So we need not just systems of knowledge, but to redefine how we think about what becomes applied and how science becomes service. And on the right is a version of the graph, the global risk assessment statement from governmental organizations to non-governmental. We know who the partners ought to be, but crafting that becomes important. And you see on the below there, you see the figure that Gustavo shows, showing the complexity of drought, which is not simply a hazard by hazard issue, cumulative over time. So next click. So in that setting, what do we need to do? We have a lot of examples of developing national and local science policy partnerships. The idea here is to strengthen the seamless link between multi-hazard early warning. Because we're dealing across SDGs, they have to be multi-hazard. We're arguing here that drought plays a thread in SDGs, plays a thread in UNFCCC goals, plays a thread in the Aichi biodiversity target, and is a thread that connects UNDRR. So here we are. Support the establishment of a global mechanism for aligning drought risk and finance. As Viola pointed out, the biggest risk we have is the defragmentation of finance that is not aligned to meet the goals of systemic risk. So there are examples, we have cases, but we also have the partnerships that Daniel and Catherine described that is trying to get us to these spaces. Thanks.
Thank you. So let's finish continuing with adaptation and the opportunities that digital twin will bring with respect to drought and to enhance preparedness and adaptation. Paco, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Andrea. I'll be very quick. My intention here is to bring in a slightly more technological perspective in which I will try to emphasize the importance of bringing the conclusions of the previous speakers concerning the complexity of drought as a hazard that has a natural component, but also a social aspect as well, and how we can bring all these closer together in the production of climate information. My name is Francisco Doblas Reyes, and I work at the Barcelona Supercomputing Center, where, among other things, we develop climate models, and we use them for experimentation in a climate services context. Let me introduce briefly what a digital twin is and what is the current scene in the generation of climate information. A digital twin is it's a digital replica of a system. The system could be natural, like the climate system, or it could be a man-made system, like a car. And the difference between a digital twin and a model is that the digital twin is built to favor interaction with the system. So having a digital twin of a car allows us to, before building the car, to make decisions about the parameters that will optimize that car and, for instance, reduce emissions or reduce the noise when it's circulating, when it's being driven. Similarly, for the climate system, in particular, with a view of producing a digital twin for climate adaptation, the idea is to not just to model the climate system with the best models possible that we can get, but also to find the way to generate an environment that will allow the interaction with that climate model, so that we can go from the current situation in which climate experiments, physical climate system experiments are produced on cycles that last several years, in which users of the climate data have to wait a long time before they can make any new impact assessments with the best climate information that they can produce from those simulations. So a digital twin of the climate we expect will favor this climate interaction with the climate system for a better climate adaptation and the decisions that are required. Similarly, for the generation of climate information, we are lucky that the physical climate system researchers have moved from a very static view of the system in which somehow most of the problems could be solved by providing more data about the different components of the climate to a more interactive view in which climate modelers, for instance, could interact and should interact much more with those scientists and developers that are working on more impact-related or even social aspects of the that are necessary for the generation of relevant climate information. Next slide, please. So bringing those two concepts together, the development of digital twins, so those digital replicas that will allow interaction with the climate models, and also with all those models that are necessary for making decisions for climate adaptation, and a completely new approach for the generation of climate information, in which climate information is co-developed between those that will use the information and those that can produce information in its different stages, not just climate modelers, but also impact modelers like hydrologists. We can develop a completely new way of developing the climate information that is fully relevant for the decisions that are necessary, not in 20 or 30 years, but now and on a much more frequent basis than with cycles of several years. It has been introduced already, the importance of early warning to make a better short-term adaptation, not just to drought, but to many other natural hazards. And this kind of new approach that is very much technologically driven, but inspired by the successes of bringing together social and natural sciences, we expect that we can favor and respond to the increasing demands for not just more data, but for more information.
Thank you, Paco. I would like to thank all the speakers that together with me have discussed drought and have shared their research and view on drought. I would like also to thank Guido Fioravanti for moderating the Slido session. And I close this side event, and I wish you a great continuation of the COP27. Thank you all.